Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, thanks so much. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, also thanks so much. As you know, I decided to start some interviews with colleagues and friends. Recently, we had one with Lama Karma that just got released on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. And today, we have another one of my dear friends, Scott Snibbe, who is the host, creator, all-around badass of actually, I would call it a widely successful Buddhist podcast called A Skeptics Path to Enlightenment, or maybe Scott, you call it a meditation podcast. We'll find out. Probably both. And so, just really wonderful to have Scott. We have some really interesting topics to discuss and share with you today. So yeah, welcome, Scott. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Scott. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I first came on. I mean, we've known each other for a long time. I'd love to give the audience some background. I mean, I think I've known you most of the time I've been practicing meditation. I mean, definitely a majority of the chunk. I can't remember. We met in 2004 or something like that.
Yeah, I think my brother introduced us, and we met in Boston when you were studying music at Berkeley College, something like that. So I remember hanging out at the pizza place there after seeing the Dalai Lama, things like that.
That's right. Yeah. So we always like cross paths because Scott's brother, for those of you listening, he the first Buddhist center I started out was called Kurukula Center in Boston, Massachusetts, and Scott's brother was a regular there, and so I'd see you time to time when you'd visit and things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is really a joy for me to be able to talk with you, because not only do I respect your work, but we're old Dharma buddies. Yeah. So I mean, I was on your podcast also, I think like a year ago, something like that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed having you on the podcast. We had to cut out some of the swear words, but it was an awesome episode. People loved it.
Oh man, I'm so sorry about that.
We had to put the E on that episode.
Oh man. So it's just like I'm like your only explicit guest on there ever.
Yeah. Was that after you stopped being a monk? Did you like cut loose again?
I think there was a period where there is some truth to that. I think there was a period where I was just like, you swung to one side and I needed to swing to the other. And now I do have to put an explicit on this podcast because I have some older content that, I still want to share. But actually, I tend to not. Yeah, I tend to behave a little bit more these days. I do have a daughter now. And so, things change. Yeah. But I really enjoy that. And just for those of you out there, I hope you'll check out, if you haven't already, I hope you'll check out Scott's podcast, Skeptics Path to Enlightenment. We're going to talk about it a little bit today. It's just really a wonderful podcast. And he has, you've had, share some of the guests. You had really amazing, Thupten Jinpa on there.
Robert Thurman, Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo, Venerable Sage Kadro, a lot of incredible teachers.
Yeah, so it's really...
Dr. Jan Willis is amazing. Twice we had Dr. Jan Willis, which was amazing.
Wonderful. Jan is interesting because I guess she's gotten more known, but for me, for a lot of years, she wasn't that well known as a Buddhist teacher. And she's really like an OG, I'd call it just like an amazing, old school.
There are very few people like her yet. Such a deeply accomplished scholar, an accessible writer, and also an extraordinary practitioner. Like the depth of her experience and that she's willing to speak about too is really extraordinary. So just an incredible being. Really in awe of her.
So check that out, everyone, if you haven't already.
Yeah, she did the last episode I did with her, because she does a lot of work around race. Obviously, she's Black. Yeah. But the last episode I did with her, I asked her to answer the question, what is enlightenment? A very difficult question. And it was an incredible episode that she went into many, many thoughts about enlightenment from different traditions. The idea of an enlightenment, that's a full stop, and then you suddenly know everything, and are able to manifest throughout the universe and see into everyone's mind. I have my own, I think we'll get into it a little bit later, but, I have my own skepticism about that idea of enlightenment. And she talks about other ideas of enlightenment, say ones where enlightenment, like the Japanese idea of enlightenment, Satori, where it's more beginning, that you've crossed you've opened a door, and that's the beginning of a whole journey that maybe lasts forever, an infinite growth, which at least to my mind appeals more and resonates more, but not like I have any direct knowledge of it.
Yeah, same. But we're kind of getting into some of the later material I like to talk about it. But it's okay. We could flow. That resonates with me too. That's kind of something I've been playing with, a hypothesis, as I study the Dharma more. And of course, my experience is quite low. My thinking mind is way ahead of where my actual experience is, in the sense of just, what I project. Which I don't think is so healthy, but I do agree with that. It seems like if enlightenment is beyond time, why would there be an end? How could you say like enlightenment is this kind of full, maybe not a full stop, but this kind of experience that you get into? Because then it would be impermanent again. So you get into these philosophical, logical conundrums, right? Problems.
Oh yeah, like Robert Thurman says, once you become enlightened, it's retroactive. He says it's as if you were always enlightened. But he says it's not like you're enlightened now, but once you become enlightened, it's as if you were always enlightened.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which is another kind of paradoxical statement. I mean, even science itself, though, says there is no time. There's, from a scientific perspective, time is one of these head scratchers, because the equations of physics and the universe don't actually indicate that time exists. That, like, to the best of understanding, time is a psychological phenomenon. So that's probably where all of these problems come from. Is just our psychological idea of time doesn't line up with how time exists, or even if time exists in a deeper sense.
So, I just want to ask you, just so my audience or whoever is listening to this can get to know you a little bit. So just kind of a little bit about your background. How did you come to study and practice the Dharma? I'd love to kind of know that.
Yeah. So how did I come to study and practice the Dharma? So I have a really weird spiritual upbringing, because I come from a ethnically Jewish family, and my parents were. All my grandparents really weren't religious, in their own ways, in communistic ways, like a lot of Jews in New York in the 20s, 30s.
Chinese food on Christmas kind of thing.
Yeah, among other things. Yeah. The old family movies have little busts of Lenin in the background of like satyrs and stuff like that. But my parents converted to being Christian Scientists, and I was raised a Christian Scientist, which actually is a great preparation for Buddhism, because its philosophical stance is actually very similar to the mind-only school of Buddhism. Like, Christian Science actually says there is no material reality, there's only the mind. And so I was raised with that, and Christian Science are better known for not going to the doctor, which is one of the tenets I don't really believe in. And I never joined the church because I was quite illogical. I love math. I love science. I was quite logical. And I loved going to Sunday school and talking about my whole life. I loved the invisible things about life were the ones that captivated me the most. Like, what happened? Where did you come from before you were born? What happens when you die? Ideas of infinity. I used to actually wake up with a very strong feeling of infinity every morning for probably the first 10 years of my life. I would just wake up and be like, whoa, just this feeling. Like, actually,
the DMT was pumping in your brain.
Yeah. Actually quite a feeling of actually past and future lives. So actually thinking I've lived forever. I'm going to live forever. A very beautiful experience, wherever it came from. But anyway, I never joined the church because it didn't make sense to me. Everybody dies, everyone gets sick. That's kind of obvious. So praying doesn't make you better, although it can help, because having a positive state of mind, at least for yourself. Yeah. So when I had a kind of godless period in my 20s where I had no religion, and it was really hard. I found it very difficult to find a happy basis in life just with like the messages I was hearing around me of, career and so on. Like even you can say materialism, but not the worst materialism, just like career, relationships. I kind of felt like I needed something deeper to ground myself in the deeper aspects of the universe and reality. So the way I became a Buddhist was through my brother, Chris, who you know, and you met before you met me, because he became a Buddhist in the late 90s because he married a Chinese woman and they went to China and Tibet and he encountered Buddhism there, which is a great story I'll skip because we don't have time. But he kept sending me Buddhist books by the Dalai Lama in particular, for about 4 years. And to be honest, I thought my brother was getting brainwashed. I was really worried that, because he's very funny. You know him. He's very funny. Yeah. He's very irreverent. He's like a punk rock skateboarder.
Yeah.
And a photojournalist is his job. And I was worried he was going to lose his personality, lose his sense of humor. But to cut it short, he didn't. I noticed after 4 years of observing him that it actually made him more kind of compassionate and open, while not changing his personality, really at all, the good parts of his personality. So he kept sending me these books, and I'll tell you, to be honest, I could not understand them. The books by the Dalai Lama he sent me were either kind of too shallow, like Art of Happiness is such a bestseller, but I couldn't really find that much gems of wisdom in that book, to be honest. And then deeper books, which I just didn't understand. I felt like Tibetan Buddhism was really complicated and I didn't get it. But I knew my brother loved the Dalai Lama, and I really liked the Dalai Lama's biography, autobiography, which I found very inspiring. So in 2000, I invited my brother to come see the Dalai Lama in Los Angeles because I said, I'll buy you tickets. I'll buy your plane ticket. I'll buy you a ticket. Let's go hang out. I know you love the Dalai Lama, and I have a lot of patience. I actually had more patience then than I think I do now. I said, I have a lot of patience. I can sit through this, and I'm curious who this guy is. So we went there, and the minute I saw the Dalai Lama, I wanted to become a Buddhist. Like that was it. I just thought, wow, what an extraordinary being. Because I knew what he went through. I knew about 1 million of his people dying. And yet he still had such compassion and humor. And then the teachings he gave were really extraordinary. So it was really more from his example as a human being that I wanted to become I wanted what he was having, like I want what he's having. And so I found a teacher. There was, from a Buddhist perspective, you might say there was a lot of karma involved. From a secular perspective, you might call it like coincidence or serendipity. But my brother's teacher, Geshe Sulga, it turned out was best friends with Geshe Dakpa. So when I went to ask my brother's teacher who I could study with, he said, oh, my closest friend from monastery is teaching in San Francisco, Geshe Dakpa. So I started studying in San Francisco at Sei Chenling with the Geshe Dakpa. And that's how I got into Buddhism. But it was super gnarly and hard to understand and bad translations. I mean, I have notebooks just scrawled. It's like one sentence that's 5 pages, I remember the first teachings I went to were on the 12 links to dependent origination, which is one of the most difficult Buddhist topics to understand. But I think just knowing the result of Buddhism, like seeing the nuns in the center and how they behaved, and some of the older practitioners, and especially my teacher, I just thought, well, you can see the result. This path is super complicated and maybe weird. Like weird is a good word for it from our perspective. Weird is subjective. Like it's not weird to Tibetans. It's the most natural thing. But to us, it's very foreign and strange. But I studied for a long time and got into it. So that's how I got into Buddhism.
Cool. Wonderful. And Geshe Dakpa, he's kind of like another OG for me. A lot of people don't know of him because he's, kind of a pretty humble, Geshe is, for those of you who don't know, is a title for a monastic accomplishment of study in a Gelugpa monastery in the Ningmen Kagyu. It's they have a Kempo degree, so it's like a degree like you get a college degree. But Geshe Dakpa is actually an incredible practitioner too, and so it kind of, a lot of people don't know that. And he spent a lot of time going around the Himalayas. He spent time with Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, and there's just a lot of really cool things in his life that that remain with him or a few close people because he's just a kind of a hidden practitioner. He's pretty amazing.
He's an incredible teacher. A little bit intimidating because he rarely smiles. He's like, but I spent a lot of time with him, and we studied. There's certain texts we study over and over again in our lineage. This Gelugpa lineage, and we studied Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I think maybe 3 times with Geshe-la I studied it, and Lam Rim over and over again, and other texts. But yes, he's a very, very inspiring teacher. A lot of it's from his behavior, because some of the greatest lessons were just to watch how humble he was, because he's obviously one of these greatest living teachers, one of the last trained in Tibet. But I remember, students asking. I remember once a student asking him over and over again, oh, we studied this last week. I remember we were doing some topic, and the student said, oh, we already went over that part last week, and Geshe-la said, oh, well. We're going to, review what we did last. And the first said, no, but I'd like to get the new material,
Of course.
and then finally he said, actually, like, oh, being bored with the material is a sign that you haven't learned it.
I had to learn that lesson too. Yeah, exactly. It's funny like that. It's funny like those simple things take a while to get. Anyways, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. I forgot in the introduction, but for those of you out there, Scott is also I also did say there's 2 Scotts here, so you might get confused. I'm Scott too, so he's Scott Snibbe, probably it says in the Zoom thing. But anyways, just in case we don't you can never have too many Scotts, I guess.
There's so many Scotts of our generation, and surprisingly, so many of them are Jewish too. I don't know why I have so many Jewish parents name their kids Scott. I think probably to hide their Jewishness.
I have a theory.
But,
yeah.
I think there's an astronaut. I think there was an astronaut named Scott at the time that inspired a lot of people, because the name just peaks around 1969 when I was born, and then kind of dies off.
I was born in 1980, so maybe it makes sense, because my parents. I mean, I think it was hippie Jewish parents probably who also just wanted to get away. Yeah, they wanted to get away from the norm, which is their roots. Like my parents did it because they were being pressured from both sides, like both grandparents, to name me after them, and they're like, well, screw you both. We're just gonna name him Scott, which is like, yeah.
It's a strange name. I don't feel like a Scott. I don't feel like a Scott, but I'm gonna ride it out.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had that thought, and then I'm like, well, what do I feel like? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's like nothing else sounds, so that might as well be a Scott. But anyway, Scott Snibbe here. I was introducing. I forgot. So Scott's also a Dharma teacher. So besides having the podcast and this wonderful podcast, The Skeptics Path to Enlightenment, he also teaches. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that and kind of like your relationship to teaching the Dharma a little bit later. But I just wanted to say that.
And I hesitate to use the term teacher. I think my favorite term is a teaching assistant. I like that a lot, because in our tradition you can't like volunteer to teach. You somehow need to be invited. And for whatever reason, they invited me to start leading meditations, which I thought a lot about, and I asked my teachers, and they all said it was a good idea because it was beneficial for people to learn from a peer, like to learn side by side from someone who has the same level of delusions and same cultural background and so on. So that was why I got some good advice from like Venerable Sangye Kadro and Venerable Rene and people like that. But I like to just say I'm a teaching assistant, because that's the thing, is we have such a high standard. You can call me whatever you want, it's fine. But we have such a high standard in our lineage for what a teacher is. And I know where I fall short of that ideal. But still, you can be of benefit. My friend Sujata Baliga, who I just love, another kind of practitioner of our generation, she says, you don't have to be perfect to do good in the world. And so that's my mantra when it comes to teaching. Is it's surprising how much good you can do without having any realizations, I think. So.
Totally, I agree. I mean, I can attest to that, actually. And I mean, it's funny. I get sometimes comments where people think I'm trying to be some kind of teacher or guru. And actually, I don't even think of I'm similar to you. I don't think of myself like that. I mean, unfortunately, we need words and labels to describe what we do. So if I'm to describe directly, I'll say, yeah, I'm giving a Dharma talk or a Dharma teaching, or I mentor people in Buddhism and meditation. This is a whole nother podcast we could have, because I think it's an important topic. We don't have to get in the weeds if you don't want to, but yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of tough because inwardly, I don't feel, I just feel like me, and I just want to be myself with others. And if people want some support, I can share some support on meditation and Buddhism with them through this podcast or whatever. But as far as a label goes, I don't care. It's just whatever is descriptive of what it is. You know?
Yeah, and the thing is, the world we live in, there's a fire hose of information, right? And if you're watching this on YouTube, that's one of the primary delivery mechanisms for that fire hose. So we really need more channels like this. Like, what you'd like to see is 24 hours of people talking about the Dharma, spirituality, the nature of reality, how to be a good person, how to accept different points of view, how to bring out your best, how to make a better world. Like, we need the same level of fire hose of that kind of virtuous material as we have of other types of material, including material that radicalizes people and divides people. So I'm all for it. I think everybody has everybody has some level of wisdom to add, like, especially if it's a constructive message.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I'd love to have this chat more. Wasn't planned for today, but whatever. We're kind of meandering.
The other stuff. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting because it made me think of, I thought this topic is kind of dear to my heart because it's what I do for both right livelihood and also for just how I want to live my life in relation to others. I love being able to share meditation and Dharma with people and support people in that through mostly my mistakes and struggles. That's mostly what ends up happening. Of course, study, but I'm hoping through some of my struggles I can save those struggles. I could save other people from having to go through them. Mm-hmm. By sharing some practical tips and some ideas with them, but around kind of titles and things like, because as Scott, Tibetan Buddhism is very hierarchical, and sometimes that feels icky or dirty or sort of I don't know, pick your word to describe it, to us as Westerners, because we want to have this illusion that we're democratic. And I say that specifically. I think it's a type of illusion. And so Khandro Rinpoche, who's an amazing, one of the few female Rinpoches or tulkus to actually be recognized as a tulku in the Tibetan tradition, she had this wonderful, she had a wonderful thing to say about this, where she said, she actually felt that healthy hierarchy is necessary, meaning like having titles and sort of, all of that is good if it's done in a healthy way, and necessary because otherwise what you're going to have is covert hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So she, I'm kind of paraphrasing her, but it's sort of like with overt hierarchy, it's there, and with the illusion of democracy, you kind of put this thing, we're democratic, but actually underneath is a covert hierarchy happening. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of problems can happen because it's kind of hidden. Where if you put it up there and in the front, you say, this person is this and that, it can help. It's not perfect, but it can help to avoid some of those problems. And something I've been reflecting on, because it's sort of like, I think how we come off within a role is where the meaning is, not what the title of the role is. And I think, like you said, in traditional Buddhism, we don't take a title, we don't, and that's what's tricky for me. For a long time, it's been really difficult to teach. I was under this, just as you've heard, this kind of stricter idea of how we teach, which is you always have to be invited to do that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There has to be an invitation, and I followed that for many, many years, especially as a monk. And then at some point, I just realized, but nobody, like, that's not how the West works.
Yeah.
So, like, should I be requested to do a podcast before I do it? And in a certain way, people ask me all the time to do stuff, so you can kind of think of that as a request. But I do value that in the tradition. that we need to be requested to teach, because it keeps the teacher humble,
Yeah.
where they're not out there kind of, self-aggrandizing. And it also makes sure the student really wants the teaching, so there's, but how do we do this? You see what I'm saying? So it gets there's so complex.
Well, I mean, this is a really good question about, and in Tibetan Buddhism, they call this guru devotion as the topic. It's an even more intense phrase. But yeah, the bottom line on this one, I totally agree, and I even use some of the same words in talking to people about this, because this idea of democracy has kind of broken down to everybody deserves your criticism, and I think just to see the flip side of that too, that everybody deserves your respect, and that some people really do deserve admiration. I think each of us can make a list, maybe a short list, of people we really admire in life, living or dead. And I think that's at the root of growth, is finding mentors and people who are more advanced than you in some direction. In the secular terms, you would find someone more advanced in your career to help you, coach you with that. But in spiritual terms, you find someone who's a little bit more advanced, or a lot more advanced, in evolving their mind towards kindness, compassion, generosity, wisdom, patience, non-reactivity, and things like that. I think the thing is, we have these kind of all or nothing ideas about hierarchy, and a lot of it comes from the military and from schools, where you still have a kind of absolute authority, at least in the generation we grew up in. I think in newer generations, it's actually quite much softer. But one thing, my teacher Venerable Rene and Geshe Dakpa are the two teachers I'm really closest to and spent the most time with. And Venerable Rene is given some really clear instructions about respecting your teacher, which just comes straight from the text. One of them is that it's a voluntary relationship. You choose whether to take on a teacher, and actually your teacher can decide whether to take you on too.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Normally there's a trial period of how long you evaluate that person, and that time period is 12 years in our tradition. So to spend a really long time evaluating someone. The other thing, I think that's a better known point in our tradition. A lesser known point in our tradition is you don't have to do everything your teacher tells you to do.
No.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize. They think it's like a cult or something like that.
Yeah.
That once you accept someone as a teacher, you just, jump off a bridge, whatever, go,
totally.
Some sexual issues, things like that. And no, that's not the case. You use your wisdom to decide whether to follow your teacher's advice. Even if it's a very high teacher, it may not be the right thing for you at the right time. So with those two pieces of advice, I think you can have healthy respect and healthy hierarchical relationships without making moral missteps or giving up your own sense of right and wrong and autonomy.
Totally, beautifully said. And I think this is just, it's so difficult because it's so nuanced and complex, because it's embedded with culture. This is on my list to talk about today as well, about kind of like what parts of Buddhism are embedded in Tibetan culture and what aren't, what are just culture. And I think it's very difficult to discern that, much more difficult than most people actually think, including myself. And so, the teacher-student relationship, just as another nuance to talk about, it's like, teacher-student relationship in Buddhism, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, there's many different styles of teacher-student relationship. Not all the relationships are guru-student. Guru is really a word reserved for Vajrayana. It's not really a word in Sutrayana. We have Kalyana Mitra, or, you have professor relationships with teachers, or meditation kind of like helper, So I think there is places as Western teachers to fit into that hierarchy, is what I'm saying, where you and I are not going to be a guru for someone, but we certainly can be like a professor, or in certain areas, or just a friend who knows a little bit more, like you said. I mean, and the basic, if you read the Lam Rim, like the basic quality, or I'm not sure if it's in Lam Rim, but it's in a text on teacher-student relationships. The basic quality to be able to teach Dharma is you have to know a little bit more than someone. Yeah. And that's it. And so it's but again, knowing where we're at, and knowing, I think being really honest, the teacher has to be really honest with themselves where they're at, so they don't have any illusion in fooling themselves they're more advanced than they are. And then I think, and then the student also has to know what they're looking for, and the teacher has to be honest. If the student's looking for the guru, and you know, I'm not a guru, the teacher has to be honest. I can't lead you in that, you know, because I don't have that experience and knowledge. But I can do this with you and plug you into other people who do have that experience. So I feel like being a teacher, you know, in this lineage, or in a teacher assistant, it actually means like we're engaging with people as a friend, as a Dharma friend, and then we're plugging them in to a whole set of lineage, you know, including people who can really lead them to enlightenment. So I kind of feel it's like that. And there's one more thing I wanted to say around this nuance. Because you were talking a little, you were bringing up, you know, what for me is this whole conversation around agency in student-teacher relationship. And for me, anytime agency is either being requested to be given up or we're voluntarily giving it up, it means there's something going wrong in the teacher-student relationship. And the way I see, now I'll use the term guru in the Vajrayana sense. The way I see the guru-student relationship happening in the Vajrayana is actually, it's actually to refine one's agency. So it's actually the opposite of what some people think it is. Some people think, oh, you're just becoming this worshiper. Actually, no, it's the opposite. The guru's there as a mirror, and you go into this very intense, intimate relationship with them. So your agency gets refined into non-dual wisdom. So it's a whole different, to me, it's a whole different thing than what I think a lot of people think it is in popular culture, you know?
Yeah, it's very radical and it's very empowering. I think the Dharma, if only there were simple answers, you know, at one level of the Dharma, there's a Buddhist 10 commandments, you know, and 7 out of the 10 are the same as the Christian ones. But that's like at the earliest level. Like there's, you know, do not kill, do not steal, do not commit sexual misconduct and things like that. But the thing is, the deeper you go into Buddhist ethics and also just looking at the reality around you, if only there were such simple answers. You know, every moment in your life is so unique and so new in your relationships and politics and in social action. Like if only there were simple answers. And that's what the Dharma is so great at, is giving you that personal grounding to be very flexible, actually, because it's not about just applying the right rule at the right time. It's the flexibility of trying to see what's happening in a particular situation and how you can be of benefit. And to be a benefit in a particular moment very often involves completely opposite behavior from one situation to the next. You know, I think we learn this a lot in thought transformation, that when you're in a conflict, strangely, not always, but strangely, often the best thing to do is actually to be very, very nice to the person that just harmed you, which is, I'm sure a lot of the audience is cringing hearing that right now, and that for good reason. Like there's a lot of times you don't want to do that, especially if you're of a class of people that have been systematically oppressed and so on. But still, from a skillful means of just getting the outcome you want, if you actually want the outcome of harmonizing, like say with your neighbor, you know, you have a conflict with, or someone at work or so on. From this tradition, a lot of time, you know, the most skillful path to that is actually being very, very nice to them and realizing that your conflict actually has very little to do with you, yourself, and your ego, that it's some long cause and effect in that person's mind, and helping them to heal, you know, their own anger and trauma will actually give you the result you want too, of you know, harmony, or even a thing you want from a thing or an action you want to get from them, you know, even a person you think of as your enemy. So this is where it's a very radical path, and it's very different from the confrontational society we live in today, where it's very self-righteous and confrontational, and also like rule-based. You know, the culture we're living in right now, that there's a quite a long list of rules on the extremes of both sides of the big kind of cultural conflicts we have today. And I think, you know, the way that these things will get resolved is probably through much more flexible thinking than rigid thinking.
I love it, man. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there. And I think, you're correct. I think that, you know, that this flexibility is the key. And it's sort of, you know, to me that also strikes this point of like what skillful means, because skillful means can mean a lot of different things within Buddhism. You know, a
Yeah.
lot of, it actually goes beyond kindness. It just means that the root of it is compassion. For me, if I was kind of like to simplify it, skillful means that the base has to be compassion, and the activity can be different, can be vast depending on the situation. But like you said, these days it's tough because there's a lot of self-righteousness, there's a lot of rigidity in views. I would even, I'm starting to play with this word puritanism as sort of a form of not just religious puritanism, but even just sort of ideological puritanism. And it just gets embedded. And then, it's funny because like then we try to be like non-conformist, but actually we're being the most conformist, sometimes. So it's very odd.
Yeah. Well, if you're really not thinking for yourself, I mean, again, this is where Buddhism is so powerful because, yes, we have, gurus and teachers and texts and so on. But really what Buddhism teaches you to do is to think for yourself and to be, and this lineage is very critical. So to be critical and to think for yourself. And I think whenever you find yourself just saying something that you read or someone else told you, or that is, what do they call it? That's sort of virtue signaling, they call it sometimes,
virtue signaling,
right? Where you're sort of saying things because you think it makes you look like a good person. It's nice to go back to...
Or feel like a good person, I would argue.
Or feel like a good person, yeah. But to go to like your own first principles, this is where it's nice to spend, this is what meditation is really great for actually sometimes, I think, even if you're doing it out for a walk, is to really think about like, what do I think about this topic or this conflict, and what does the other person think about it? What's their perspective? I think whenever you come to a point like of saying, I can't understand why X, Y, Z, that's an invitation to try and understand, even if not to be convinced by their point of view, but actually to better change things. You need to understand why someone else thinks the way they do.
Beautiful. And so I want to segue now into talking about a skeptic's path to enlightenment.
Yeah, let's do it.
That's okay. Yeah. So, but, to segue a little bit, I was, on this note, I've been kind of flirting with, because politics is so polarized in the United States right now. I've been flirting a lot with actually it's just a natural response for me, but I would kind of call it like political, like being a political agnostic kind of, where it's very much the attitude, both on social issues and politics I employ, which is sort of like taking a step back and trying to observe the battlefield, so to speak, and make up my own decisions and opinions based on sort of actually taking a step back and trying to look, as best I can through compassion, not just through my own self-interest, right? But this idea of just go ahead. I was going to say this idea of agnosticism, in that, how, moving into a skeptic's path to enlightenment, because I'd love to know how that kind of connects even to how we do our work of embodying flexibility and embody in our own practice, obviously, but also, being able to mirror that in our work. Because for me, that's such a like core value of the work I do, where I think some people assume I call it Buddhism mentoring or meditation or Buddhist meditation mentoring or whatever. But actually it's more about training in some knowledge and then using flexibility to work with that knowledge as a path, a meditation path. But sorry, you had something to say, but I'd love to hear how this relates to skeptic's path for you, skeptic's path to enlightenment.
Yeah, how does it relate to skeptic's path? I think that's a good place to go. So the point of a skeptic's path to enlightenment is that I got invited to teach meditation, in particular Lam Rim meditation. So in our tradition, it's a 1,000-year-old tradition of the Lam Rim, which ordered the Buddha taught this vast array of teachings, many of them contradictory actually. And so the Lam Rim ordered those teachings and resolved a lot of confusion and conflict and even kind of ethical problems of its time, and gave this quite succinct, clear, not necessarily easy, but path to follow in order to do what the Buddha did, ideally, attain enlightenment. So we study and practice it starts with how precious it is to be alive and to have a body and to have some freedom and opportunity in life. And then it ends with, how to have universal compassion for all beings and the ultimate nature of reality, the interdependent nature of reality. So I was invited to teach this. This is how we were leading meditations at Seichen Ling. And I used the traditional outlines at first, but we would advertise the courses as open to anybody, you don't have to be Buddhist. Yet with the topics, and even the first topic of the preciousness of life, immediately you hit these Buddhist beliefs, I think what most people would call beliefs. For example, the preciousness of life starts off by saying life's so precious because you've had an infinite stream of lives before where you were a turtle, a ghost, a superhero, and now you're human, which is at the best form, and so you better take advantage of it because you might be born in a hell realm later. Or so you see, in one sentence, right at the beginning of the Lam Rim, it posits karma, other realms, and past and future lives, which are probably the three big things about Buddhism that science doesn't support right now. They might be true, actually, and I might believe in them. In fact, I am actually quite convinced by a number of those things, and maybe not in exactly the form that I was taught. So what I came to, I went slowly, but I saw there was some very, very negative reactions when I was leading certain meditations, and I thought that was a real shame. And so I started to think and talk to my teachers, well, it seems like we could adapt these meditations, which are all in the tradition of analytical meditation, meditations that use thoughts and feelings to steer your mind towards some virtuous state, a state of greater happiness and insight and compassion. So my teachers were encouraging in this, and the Dalai Lama has written a couple books on this too, like Beyond Religion. You couldn't say it more clearly. The time has come to go beyond religion, Ethics for a New Millennium. And so I started making notes over the years of how to adapt some of these meditations to a secular form. And then about 3 years ago, my life changed. So I had more time to finally work on this. And so I founded this organization with my buddy, Stephen Butler, who you know, and made a concerted effort to make a wholly secular form of the Lam Rim, trying to preserve as much as possible of the experience and the benefit of transforming your mind while only grounding it in what science and modern psychology currently say is supportable about the mind and about reality. So that's Skeptics Path in a nutshell. And was started as a podcast, not because the goal was to create a podcast, but because it's such a great medium to test things, to reach people, to be right in people's ears, which is so close to thought. And it's a combination of lectures on the topics that can let you just think about the ideas, because a big part of analytical meditation is you do it out in the world as you encounter conflicts and just as you see reality. And then also meditations, guided meditations, which is from all the Buddhist traditions, it's so essential to meditate, right? There's no way to get a deep felt, what they call realization, much deeper, something that it's like you feel it in every cell of your body. Like when you fall in love, that kind of feeling. That's that level of understanding in general, I don't think can come except through meditation. So that's Skeptics Path. It started out as a podcast, and now there's a few more steps. I did 3 years as a podcast, and then piloting a course at the Jamyang Center in London for 2 years. Now we're going to have our first online course, which is launching in March, which is based on that Jamyang course. And I'm also working on a book too that will come out in the fall. So it's moving from the podcast, which was really testing the idea. I really wanted to develop the ideas with an audience, get feedback too from the audience and from teachers before putting it into a more structured form.
Yeah, wonderful, beautiful. I'm looking forward to the course and the book too. So this whole idea of skepticism, to me, it's sort of like it sort of feels like it's a very natural part of Buddhism. That's one area I wanted to explore with you today. But before that, I'm just kind of curious your own relationship to skepticism, because you kind of named some. Why you started a Skeptics Path to Enlightenment, the podcast, and now the course in the book. So there's this sense of how you're working with others. But how do you relate to it? Because maybe we can, we
Yeah,
probably share a
so-
lot there. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I came in, first of all, I think it's worth defining skepticism, because skepticism is not cynicism. So cynicism
Yes.
is when you just reject things outright without even analyzing their claims, because of you have certain hard, steadfast beliefs. It's really another form of belief, is being a cynic. So
For
a
sure.
skeptic, I really like the idea of a rational skeptic, which is someone who is curious yet critical. So combining those two things. So you're curious enough to be open to all kinds of ideas as they come by. There's so many amazing, interesting ideas, and so much evolution too. We're quite early in humans' ability to understand our minds and the universe. But then criticality, looking at ideas and using whatever instruments you have to critically probe whether something may be true or not, or beneficial or harmful. There's kind of different ways. You can say true or false, or beneficial, harmful, are sort of the Buddhist ways in general of testing things.
Virtuous, non-virtuous, if we want to get
virtuous,
more,
non-virtuous. So, and that, it's not all Buddhists. I mean, the Buddha did say that. There's famous quotes from the Buddha where he says, test these teachings like gold. In the old days, that you'd test gold by like chewing it and stabbing it and all these different ways to see if something was really gold or not. And that's the famous quote from the Buddha about being critical. But not all Buddhist lineages actually take that on. The lineage that we are in, this Indo-Tibetan lineage that came from the Nalanda monastery in particular, is very, very strong, as you know, on this aspect of criticality and testing and debate, and especially logic, using the power of like logical philosophy, and applying logic to ethics, logic to the nature of reality, and logic to human behavior. So I really like that. It doesn't appeal to every type of person, So many people, it's a different type of path that's more devotional, like a purely devotional path where they're just deeply inspired by another person's example, which I think you and I have both experienced that part too. But the logic critical debate part is the one that Skeptics' path is very, very much inspired by. And so when I started out, I didn't accept any of those things. I was kind of a head scratcher about reading. The Dalai Lama is supposed to be the 14th Dalai Lama. But the Dalai Lama's own criticality really inspired me, because he even said, I was reading some of his books and he said, I'm only sure about 2 of the past Dalai Lamas. He said, he
said, maybe I was them, or something like that.
Maybe I was them. Because even he has said, there may be some fallibility. So I really like how open he is to that. And in his books, he's also, talked about karma, for example. Recently, this book with Thubten Chodron, there's this long series of books that have come out. And in this one called Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature. And he talks about karma in that book very lucidly. And he says, my perspective now is that the material world operates according to the physical laws, more or less. Our psychological world operates to some other set of rules, that he would call karma, which is these seeds that when you do negative things, they have some negative result later in your mind. When you do positive things, they keep building up positive things. There's support from that from neuroscience. The principle of neuroplasticity says exactly the same thing, not across lifetimes, of course, just in this lifetime, but that if you have a thought, whenever you have a thought, it reinforces that neural pathway, so you're more likely to have it. And that's how you form habits. A habit takes about 2 months to form if you keep working at it. And you can create good habits and bad habits. So these things are but the things I was skeptical about was really most of Buddhism's claims, except the psychological ones to start, because it was obvious. The evidence that practicing Tibetan Buddhism would make you like a happy, compassionate, effective, wise person was immediately clear from the people I met who had practiced it for a long time, especially the Dalai Lama. So I believed that actually right away. There seemed to be a lot of evidence that the path had this result, but I was quite skeptical about a lot of the more far out aspects of Buddhism, like past and future lives, karma, and other realms too. The idea that there's an actual hell and that there's higher realms and things like that. That's a bit hard to accept. So those are the things I was skeptical about. I don't know how far you want to get into this, because some of them I have become convinced about and some that I still have a lot of doubts about.
Yeah, no, I would like to know. I mean, first, I'd like to center this kind of, I call it a process-oriented approach. That's kind
Yeah.
of one of the ways I name working with skepticism, and I do create a difference. But I like how you use cynicism. I use the word doubt. So like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, doubt is one of those mental factors that actually in Buddhism can go either way. It can be both positive and negative. But I think in this way, when some people claim to be a skeptic, or they're let's say they're practicing skepticism, they're just looking one way. I find. I mean, I find this in myself. Like if there's something I don't like, I'm looking one way. I'm not looking back at my dislike. You know what I mean? I'm not asking questions, or I'm not critiquing. Why do I dislike this? I mean, I do that as a practitioner, but when I'm in a strong reaction, obviously I'm stuck in the reaction, so I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of sense of like, I would say like skepticism is actually embedded in Buddhism, but it's that two-way critique.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like one thing I was thinking about was
Yeah.
talking. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things to be skeptical in Buddhism is about your own thoughts. And there's this famous phrase, don't believe everything you think. That is probably the most important thing to be skeptical about is your own thoughts. And that if something pops into your mind, that does not mean it's true. It doesn't even mean it's important. It just means it popped into your mind, and it's there, and it's worth accepting it. That's mindfulness. I accept that thing just popped into my mind. But then, do I have to act on it? Where did that idea even come from? Is that even an idea that, quote, I believe? Like, is it something I read? Is it something I heard on YouTube? Is it something I want people to think I believe? I think that kind of that starts to become the essence of analytical meditation. That's where mindfulness meditation transitions into analytical meditation quite quickly as soon as you start to question what comes into your mind, and they work together really nicely, right? Because something pops into your mind, you can observe it, you can accept it, you can be gentle and compassionate with yourself. But then analytical meditation can say, okay, is this harmful or beneficial to me? Is this true? Or from the deeper ways that I understand, that things to be true or false or virtuous or non-virtuous.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, my friend Elizabeth Matis Namgyel, who just agreed to be on the podcast, so she's coming.
Oh, great.
She has a book called The Power of an Open Question, and I love the way she talks about. I talk about it as a process-oriented approach to life and the mind and everything, basically. But I think it's basically synonymous to talk about it as an open question, where it's like, for me, analytical meditation over the years. By the way, just for the listeners out there, in Tibetan Buddhism, we do a combo, or we work with kind of an equal combo of what's called Chegom and Jokom in Tibetan. And Chegom represents the analytical meditation Scott is talking about, where it's this sense of chewing something over. So we're chewing over, like, the impermanent nature of something, or as Scott said, we might be reflecting on or chewing on what is the nature of our human rebirth in relation to that being precious and valuable. And we have all different kinds of analytical meditations, or working with Chegom. And then Jokom is resting meditation, where shamatha, or meditative awareness, is a type of jokom. But when we do analytical meditation in the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, we generally do, it's not just analytical, it's usually a combo of chegom and jokom, where we rest on whatever temporary conclusion or insight we've had, through the chegom, or the analytical meditation. So sorry, just a little break to introduce that. And for those of the listeners who don't know that or haven't studied the tradition that much. But anyways, what I wanted to say was, for me, the analytical process, the Qigong process, it's almost like an open question when I'm doing it. Now, it took me a lot of years to learn how to do that, because, often in the West, we analyze for security and safety, which I think is a very bad decision. It hasn't worked out for me so well. And then we analyze for like a surety, and actually like a definitive judgment. This is how it is. And in Buddhism, I found it's quite different, because it's more of an analytical meditation, or curiosity, or process, or all these different ways to talk about it. It's more of this open question. But it's a question we're not answering. We're just continually asking it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the key. There's a lot of different ways of saying that, but yeah, I think that the essence of meditation, same thing for me over the years. It seems like the essence of meditation is asking questions, like especially ones that can't ever be answered. The question like, who am I? Is one of the best questions. Like, who am I exactly? Even without much training, asking yourself that question is quite valuable.
I agree. Yeah. Wonderful. So let's see. We probably got it. Another 10. Actually, Scott, would you be open to I'm sorry to put you on the spot. We're recording, but would you be open to a part 2? Because I just think we got so much to talk about.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, totally. Yeah. Let's do more again. That's great.
Yeah. Because I think we meandered into some really useful topics, actually. Yeah. And there's so much more I want to talk to you about. But
we'll just come back and do more. It's great.
Yeah. But in our last, 5-10 minutes or something, maybe I'll open up to you kind of like, what would you, anything on your mind that you want to close out our part 1 with, anything from what we discussed or anything around, skepticism. I think we can keep going with this, obviously, and there's so much to talk about the practice of it, how it relates to traditional Buddhism, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I talked to Robert Thurman, he said, because I asked him he's one of my real heroes, and he said so many wonderful things. I think one of the biggest ones was that very early on, in fact, it was very close by. I live here in Berkeley, and he gave a talk in Berkeley in the first years I was studying Buddhism. And he said, the root of all of our problems, he said, he's quite a dramatic speaker, he said, the root of all of our problems, he said, do you want to know the root of all of our problems? Everyone's like, yeah. Well, it's this. It's that out of everyone in this room right now, in this big hall, out of everyone in this town, out of everyone in this country, out of everyone in this world, maybe out of everybody, what if there are other worlds? What if there are other beings? Out of all of them, I think I'm more important than everyone else. And I think that's the thing he says to be skeptical about, that if you really look into the root of why we suffer and why we feel, and these problems like anxiety and depression, I think, which are the most like the problems that plague people the most in our culture, that belief is at the root of it, this idea that you could call it self-centeredness. And it's confusing to say that because a lot of people hearing that will think, well, no, I actually think the opposite. I actually think I'm an imposter and I'm weaker. I'm less important than other people. But from the Buddhist perspective, that is also a manifestation of ego, and it's hard to hear that.
It's hard to hear that.
But it's still a focus on yourself, that I, the strong I, is less important than everyone else, or it's more important. Almost all of us fall onto one spectrum or the other of either like ego or small-mindedness.
Yeah.
And so getting rid of that completely, this is what Robert Thurman says to be skeptical about. Be skeptical of the idea that you're an independent, autonomous being and that you're separate from other beings. And of course, this is actually the most advanced teaching in Buddhism, but it's also the ultimate antidote. And as you go through the Lam Rim, there are these like coarser to finer antidotes from just thinking how precious your life is, which is just that alone could be great for if everybody thought that's actually enough, I think, in many ways to live a meaningful life.
I did a 3-month retreat on that. It healed a lot of my trauma, actually.
It's extraordinary because you realize this is what I have. This is all there is today. And what do I want to do? What do I want to do with this day? Do I want to binge watch Netflix? Like maybe a little bit, but what good can I do with this day? But
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, a lot of us experience a lot of feelings of worthlessness, that we're not a worthy person. And just reflecting on that and really going deep into perfect human rebirth is one example. It really helped me to work with that, to just actually start to see there's a sense of not just worth, but like value to this human body, how it can be used. Yeah.
It's so extraordinary, right? It's so extraordinary that there was actually this is a nice quote for skeptics, and it was actually one of the ones that helped me a lot in understanding the preciousness of life, is that Voltaire, I love reading, and I read that Voltaire who's an extraordinary writer who really transformed society with his writing in many ways. Like he did, he's responsible for ending duels actually by making fun of them, by making fun of how stupid it was for macho European dudes to shoot each other over their arguments. He made duels seem stupid. Which is a much better way to. It's a much better way to transform society, to get people. That's what Steven Pinker says, is that society is transformed actually by people thinking things are stupid and funny, from respecting them. But what Voltaire said was, it is no less more miraculous to live two lives than to live one, and that really brought home the preciousness of life to me. Is, wow, it's amazing just to be alive. It's way more amazing, actually, to be alive at all than to be alive twice or three times or infinite times. Just the fact, because this is all we have. This is all we have, and we can see it around us. And there's so much opportunity, and you can see the examples of other people. Look how much some people make of their lives, and not necessarily famous people. Just everybody, caretakers, nurses, Doctors Without Borders. There's so many people, social rights activists. There's so many extraordinary people doing extraordinary things with their life, like including the people listening. It's not like we're all part of it. So I think that is a nice view of skepticism, is actually to see the wonder in what you can prove and establish. Look at this universe, a 14 billion year old universe, 14 billion light year sphere of like 14 billion, 28 billion light year sphere with 14 billion galaxies inside of it. Like I think it's more actually. It's like 100 billion galaxies, they say, and 100 billion stars in our Milky Way. Like I get the awe that people used to feel from the religious awe of infinite lifetimes, or the idea of very highly realized deities and things like that. I think for a lot of people that awe can be replaced with the awe of science. So not using science to prove meditation works or Buddhism works, which there is lots of evidence for, but using the awe of science that Giordano Bruno once said, "Your God is so much bigger than you think," as they were burning him on the stake for saying there were galaxies. He was being burnt. The Catholic Church burnt him for saying there were galaxies. And he said, I believe in God too. Don't burn me. But God is way bigger than you think. God is so much bigger than you. And I think some of that reasoning, I think, is we can use science actually to have the same sense of awe. Because I think awe is this extraordinary feeling that I went to a great talk just 2 days ago on awe by this Dasher Keltner, who's a professor here at Berkeley and just wrote a book on awe. But he said what awe is a simultaneous feeling of smallness and bigness, and like your relationship to that you feel quite humbled on the one sense by the vastness of something, whether it's space or time or love or whatever. But then you feel part of it. You don't feel separate from it. So I think science for me is one of the best gateways to that, as well as certain like emotional experiences you have in relationships or in deep meditation. So I think that awe is accessible to everybody, and you don't need to believe in anything to have it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a sense of going back to, maybe we'll have to bookmark it here. I'd love to continue our talk in part 2 about, just one of the many things I want to talk to you about like how skepticism relates to the actual practice of Buddhism and the study of Buddhism. Because, for me, there's this element of, like I'm doing it anyways, whether there's a religious or spiritual path or not, where I'm gauging and kind of not quite analyzing, but also just gauging myself and my existence against something, against another person, like my relationship to them or the world around me or my work or whatever. And in Dharma, we do that through the path. So it's almost like, for me, the Dharma has become, over the years, it's become less and less each year a path of belief and more a path of like something to kind of like, hit my, what do you call it? Like squash ball against, like to check, and question my existence and question reality and question my thoughts and emotions. And so I think there's I was going to say around awe just briefly is that you know, within that process, there's a sense of awe in Buddhism. You know, Elizabeth, also another person who talks about awe a lot in relation to the Dharma. Awe, it seems to be the sense where we can, yeah, it is that kind of bigness and smallness that then releases into kind of a on the Buddhist path into like a not knowing, like a willingness to let be or let go, and to rest in like this sense of like, it's not quite confoundedness, it's just sort of like and then we rest, and then we can actually find some wisdom there, you know, within the Buddhist path.
Yeah. You know, one of my brother's teachers, this is kind of like a koan, but when part of how I got into Buddhism, my brother was always telling me such funny stories about the teachings he went to when he was learning Buddhism and I was just watching. And one of the stories he told me once was going to a teacher, and the teacher said, you know that feeling you have when you're about to say something and you forgot it? And my brother's like, yeah. And the teacher said, well, that's the feeling you want to have all the time.
It's not so appealing to most people, I think, you know.
But it's kind of but I really do think, and also the deeper you go, you know, there is nothing to believe in, actually. When you really probe it, when you probe the nature of reality, there's like, everything is a convention. There's conventional reality and ultimate reality, and the conventions of things that have labels and solidity and like parts that have come together, they're conventions that help us function in the world. They do exist, but they only exist like conditionally and
relationally,
relationally and interdependently. So the things you quote believe in, they don't ultimately exist, which doesn't, as you know, doesn't mean they don't exist, but they exist way more subtly and interdependently and like flimsily, you know, like as you look into them, it all dissolves. And it doesn't mean there's no morality or anything like that. It's just the complexity and interdependence and like infinite regress of reality doesn't offer a final answer, but it's a question you can keep asking, and then it gives you an experience that goes beyond words, right? Like that's the frustrating thing about talking about Dharma is the words aren't the experience. Like they say, you know, the map isn't the territory. You know, a map is not the place you're visiting. And I think Buddhists can confuse that sometimes, that the words are the experience, but they aren't. It's so nice because we each get to have our unique experience. The Dalai Lama once said, everyone gets enlightened in their own way, which I love. Like when I was really worried about losing yourself, like into some void and merging with cosmic consciousness or something, you know, heard the Dalai Lama say, you know, everyone gets enlightened. I think it actually answered my question. Like I got to write the question and he answered it in one of these public talks. And he said, oh, everyone gets enlightened in their own way.
That's so cool. I never heard that before, that he said that.
And I love that. It made me so happy to hear that. And you see it in the Dalai Lama because he has huge personality, yet no ego. Like you can still have personality and friends too, and best friends, things like that. But no ego. So that's very inspiring.
Totally. I think that's one of the difficult things for people to grasp, is that there can be no grasping and no, you know, personal grasping to an autonomous self, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And yet a lot of activity unfolding, beautiful activity like the Dalai Lama. You know, I never heard him. That's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that quote from me. It reminded me of another quote, which is kind of, it's different, but you know, where Chogyam Trungpa said, no one claps for you when you get enlightened.
That's funny.
Single quote helped me so much. It has just helped me to let go of so much.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's actually one of those things about at least our tradition, probably all the Buddhist traditions, is that, you know, you're not supposed to say anything about your realizations. You're not supposed to admit you're enlightened or a bodhisattva. And you can see that ties back to what you started out with the authority. Yeah. Because you can see the problem of a world where it's okay to say you have realizations and that you're enlightened, because then a lot of people will hijack that to manipulate people and to trick people. So you want to watch out. Anyone who says they have those achievements. Yeah,
that's one of my red flags I share with people. If someone even like, if they're talking about their realization and awakening, just run the other way, because either they don't, one, they have no clue what awakening actually is, or two, they're totally a charlatan. So
but it's a nice aspect of this path. Like the couple aspects of it that keep it relatively pure, you know, in this lineage is like, you can't teach unless someone invites you to, and
Yeah.
you can't brag about your realization.
Yeah. So, going back to the beginning of our conversation too, just to bookend this, Geshe Tsolga, the same teacher that your brother shares with me, he was
and he was my teacher too. Yeah, he was an amazing teacher. A little bit.
Yeah, really amazing teacher. Again, similar to Geshe Dakpa, very kind of under the radar, amazing scholar, but also amazing practitioner. And I felt had realization. And he when I got to know him more, because I was his attendant and cook for 3 years. So I got to know him really well. I lived with him for
lucky.
3 years. Yeah. It was pretty, that was one of my, I would say I could name a few formative experiences in my life, and that was one of them that would be included.
So fortunate.
Yeah. It was, I mean, unfortunately, I probably wasted a lot of it being a 21-year-old idiot. But anyways, I have to forgive myself. So he actually was a big skeptic of the Tulku system. He wasn't a fan. He wasn't a fan. And the Tulku system, for those of you who don't know, is the system of recognizing reincarnated or incarnated lamas from life to life, and giving them status and title and education in that role. And so, anyways, and the reason was he felt if someone is coming back having taken their realization from the last life, they're going to show it. They're just going to naturally be an incredible, compassionate, useful, with skillful means and knowledgeable person, and kind of that stuck with me for 20 years. That of also Soknu Rinpoche, one of my main teachers, he kind of says more or less the same thing, where he's like, if you want to benefit others, transform yourself. And you don't have to think, how do I benefit others, or how do I help, or how to do this? It just happens. You just do it because you've transformed yourself. So it's kind of become, when I kind of get out of line with myself, I remember those and just come back to that simple of I'm just doing this moment. I'm this weird, Jewish, Italian, Buddhist, strange guy, and I'm just trying to do this moment, and that's it. And I'm trying to put my best effort into it. And so I don't know, there's something there, but man, this has been wonderful, Scott. And, I really am looking actually forward to part 2, because I think we can go more into this area of how skepticism meets the actual practice of the Buddhist path, right? We didn't talk about that much. Yeah, no, let's talk about that more next time. I really enjoy talking to you. Yeah, man. And for those of you out there, please check out A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. Incredible podcast if you haven't listened. And you have the course coming out in March, correct? Yeah, our first course is going to start, I think it's on March 5th. So if you go to our website, skepticspath.org, you can sign up. And I'd love to join you. If you find it, it's really 10 years of work of working with Dharma centers, and then the podcasts, and then at the Jamyang Center. So I'm really looking forward to having it reach anybody in the world who can attend. Yeah. So consider joining that if you'd like to learn more about analytical meditation. Wonderful. Well, thanks, my friend. It's really been, thank you, Scott. This was great to see you. Awesome. You're awesome. Right. Okay, take care.